politics of the other side, and we end up, candidly, that's not going to stand the test of time. That's not going to take us to a place that solves this problem in time to keep the kind of things that the senator from Louisiana mentioned might happen if we don't. So my time is up in all likelihood, and I yield the floor for that reason.
Senator for Louisiana.
Thank you. Let me just respond. Thank you, Madam President, for 5 minutes to my good friend, and then I'm going to have to take the chair as required and relieve you. And thank you for your consideration. Let me say how much, again, I respect the senator from Tennessee. No one on his side of the aisle, except perhaps maybe for the good senator from Alabama, has spent more time on budget issues, because that's actually the senator from Alabama's job. But Senator from Tennessee has taken upon himself to be a leader, and I do agree with him that we are on the right page, the right chapter, in the right book to talk about some fiscal issues. I don't agree that the strategy to get us here was the right strategy, but we're here. No sense in pointing fingers. I do agree that the Senate needs to really try to find our way forward, because the senator from Tennessee is correct. Where we are now, there are no winners and losers. It's just about doing what's right for the American people. I want to do that for the state of Louisiana. He wants to do that for the state of Tennessee. And we have lots of people that are counting on us to try to lower our temperatures and find a way forward. Secondly, I also agree with him that whatever we can come up with here has to be broadly supported on both sides, or at least core supported on both sides, because, you know, it's going to have to be something we can bring to the House and say, look, this is the best we can do, and we cannot go over this cliff. But thirdly, I want to make a point. On this Budget Control Act that's law, and let me just say the Affordable Care Act, in lawyers' terms, and I'm not one, they would say it's not settled law. It's law that's passed. It's law that's been upheld by the Supreme Court, but there haven't been enough court tests. But I'll take your word. It's settled as far as we're concerned. It passed. The Budget Control Act is as well. But this is the point that I'd like to make to my good senator from Tennessee, my good friend. The House is willing to take the sequester, which is the lower number, the lowest number. But what they do, which is very disingenuous, and what the Democrats will not be for, is basically taking the lower number overall, but keeping defense at a very high number, and therefore cutting the heck out of everybody else. No agriculture money, no education money, no health care money, no nothing. But they want to keep defense whole. Now, that is what the House is trying to do. I realize that's not what my colleagues on the Republican side here want to do, but that's our problem, the senator from Tennessee knows, is not just taking the lower number, but how that number is going to be allocated across appropriations. And just to say, that's how the defense appropriations bill is put together. It absorbs all of the money and leaves all the other budgets starving. Now, I know defense is important. I'm a Democrat that supported a strong defense. I have stood against irresponsible cuts to the Defense Department. But to take a lower number in the whole budget and say, okay, we'll take a lower number, but we give it all to defense, and then you can't fund anything in health and education and social services that are so important, that's not right either. So and one more point, I said one, but one more point is this. And the senator from Tennessee has been very brave, because there aren't that many brave people around here, but he's been one of the brave ones that have said, you know, we may need to raise a few revenues here and there. We can't solve this whole problem by cuts alone. And so in the last big deal that we did, we were able to figure out how to raise some revenue and also make some cuts so that we could have a good way, a steady way to balance our budget and not pull the rug out from underneath this very promising economy. I mean, I've got 5% unemployment in Louisiana. I'm not talking as a state that doesn't have jobs. Our problem is we have so many jobs, we need people to fill them. It just breaks my heart that we're about ready to pull the plug on that, and we're close. And I know how much my people are counting on us getting this done. So I want to thank the senator, but I hope that he'll also stand up to some of the other voices over there that say we can solve this problem by cutting, and we can just cut mandatory programs, we can just cut entitlements, that's all we have to worry about, and I think he knows that that is not correct. And I yield the floor.
Madam President, I know the senator from Alabama. I want to just take 30 seconds and say to for the record, I don't want anybody to think that I thought the strategy that was undertaken was the right strategy. And if I was misunderstood, I think I've been really clear that I did not think that took us to a positive place. But the point is, we are where we are, and we're finally on the right page. Let's just stay there and solve this problem. With that, I want to yield the floor, and I see the outstanding and distinguished senator from Alabama, a neighboring state, is here, someone I very much enjoy working with, and I look forward to his comments and yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Alabama.
Madam President, I thank the Chair for the opportunity to share some thoughts, and Senator Corker for his commitment and leadership on these difficult budget issues. As a businessman, as a man who fabulously ran an important city in Tennessee, he knows you have to live within your means. And there are limits to what we can do and maintain a healthy financial future for America. It just is. And so that's important, I think, for all of us. I wanted to first respond to a couple of things that Senator Reid and Senator Durbin, the Democratic leaders, said earlier this afternoon. It really sort of surprised me. First of all, he said there's no plan to break the caps. I was, as the senator from Tennessee was, we were with the president yesterday, and he said there's strong push from Democratic senators to spend above the limits of the Budget Control Act that all agreed to in August of 2011. That is buttressed virtually conclusively by the fact that after the Budget Control Act numbers were agreed to, it allowed growth, substantial growth. Instead of growing $10 trillion over the next 10 years, we would reduce the growth of the budget to $8 trillion. It's not really a cut over the 10-year period. The President submitted a budget in January of 2012, less than 6 months later, that would spend $1 trillion over those cuts. Cut half of the, and the Democratic budget that just passed this year, first time in 4 years, it would have increased spending by $1 trillion over those cuts. So I'm a little bit uneasy here because I think there is an effort and will be an effort which is unacceptable to deal with those cuts or break the caps that limit the growth of spending is the right way to say it. Of course, there are some cuts that we need to make in this business. And then I think Senator Reid and Durbin talked about President Bush's problems with deficits. And he doesn't do a great job in containing deficits. The highest deficit he had in 1 year was $487 billion. The year before he left office, the deficit he had was $167 billion. President Obama took office and rammed through, with unanimous Democratic support, a stimulus bill that added $1 trillion to the debt of the United States. The biggest single spending bill ever. Every penny of that borrowed, because we didn't have any money. We were already in debt, so we borrowed $1 trillion to spend that. And for 4 consecutive years, well, really 5 years now, we will have averaged over $1 trillion in deficits per year. Now, we've never been over $500 billion a year before that. $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. So his average in 5 years is unprecedented. It's stunning. We've never, ever seen such a debt accumulation in such a rapid period of time. And I think we need to understand that, and our colleagues continue to defend it and still want to spend more. And their budget would spend $1 trillion more. That's, that they voted on and passed in this conference. And so they use the word extreme to anybody who wants to reduce spending and try to attack people who want to reduce spending. Senator Durbin talked about we need a sound dollar. Well, is a dollar sounder today Senator Corker, because this Congress, reached a bipartisan agreement to reduce spending by $2.1 trillion, the growth of spending by that much. Isn't it stronger today than it would have been if we hadn't done that? So, yes, it was a tense time in August of 2011. People weren't quite sure how it would all end, but it ended in a modest reduction in the growth of spending, which I think made the country better for it. And the last thing we should ever contemplate is the backing off of that agreement, and not at least adhering to that agreement. We need to do a good deal more. So I wanted to share a few thoughts first in general. I'll go into some detail if we have time about the nature of the Budget Control Act, explain that in more detail. But we've heard the word extremist thrown around a lot over the recent days. Let me share with you what I think is extreme. Extreme is adding $6 trillion to the debt of the United States in 5 years. That's extreme. And saying there's no spending that we can cut. We've cut every dime that we can cut. Extreme is forcing a health care law through that the American people opposed, and telling them that you can take $500 billion out of Medicare and strengthen Medicare and then fund Obamacare, double counting $500 billion that will come back to haunt us in the future. Extreme is refusing to make any concession, negotiation, or alteration to a health care law that is going to financially bankrupt us. It will add another $6 trillion to the long-term debt of America, almost as much as Social Security, according to the Government Accountability Office. They said it would be fully paid for. The President said in a joint session of Congress it would not add one dime to the debt now or ever, period. And Government Accountability Office says it will add $6 trillion to the long-term debt of America. This is how a nation goes broke. Instead of fixing Social Security and Medicare that need fixing, we start a whole new program that adds almost as much debt over time as they do. Extreme is knowing that we are on an unsustainable debt path and refusing to do anything about it. In the last 5 years, we spent more than $15 trillion and added more than $6 trillion to the debt. Never has so great a sum been spent for so little benefit. Consider, nearly 60 million working-age Americans aren't working. They're out of work. I wish everybody had 5% unemployment rate, but the truth is unemployment rate in the country is 7.3%. And we have the lowest workplace participation since 1975. There are fewer people working today than there were in 2007. That's the key number. How many people are working? Our population is up, but the number of people actually having jobs is down, and more of those are part-time jobs. The median household income is lower than it's been since any year since 1998. Two-thirds of the job creation this year has been part-time. We spent $1 trillion last year on welfare and poverty programs, state and federal combined. 1 in 6 Americans are on food stamps. Let me repeat, 1 in 6 people in this nation are receiving food stamps from the federal government. This economy is not healthy. Despite the endless inundation of federal funds in some of our big cities, 1 in 3 children still live in poverty. In our nation's capital, in nearby Baltimore, 1 in 3 residents are on food stamps, and 1 in 3 youth live in poverty. This isn't a booming, growing economy. We borrowed, taxed, spend. It hasn't produced results that are good for our country. Growth is way below what it was projected to be at this time. They were predicting 3.5% or 4% growth. We're not likely to have 2% growth this year. The only people who seem to be gaining in this economic plan is the political class who came up with it, and those with enough lobbyists to profit from it. What does the President say? What does Senator Reid say? Who do our friends on the other side of the aisle, what do they say? Spend more money. That's what they say we need to do. Produce a budget that spends another $1 trillion. And we've got to go to conference on that budget, they say. Kind of odd, after 4 years of not even producing one at all, now they're anxious to take one that adds $1 trillion to the debt to conference. Put more people on government aid. Energy prices too high. Oh, mail people another check. They're hurting. Let's send out government checks. Factory closed. Mail another check out to help people who didn't get a job. Your school failing, send them more money. Families falling apart, mail another check. And then there's this one. Too many Americans unemployed. Bring in foreign workers to do the job.
Senator's time has expired.
Madam President, so we're at 10-minute.
Senator's correct.
I would ask consent to have 2 additional minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection?
I thank the Chair. So by what definition can we call what we've been seeing for the last 5 years as success? It's just not. That's the problem. We've taxed more, we've spent more, we've regulated more, we've borrowed more, we've stimulated more. And it hasn't produced solid growth. We've had the slowest recovery from a recession since the Great Depression. So this is the plan. Reduce wages. It results in this, a reduction in wages, an increase in unemployment, more part-time jobs, more regulations, higher energy costs. And we make that up how? Well, the government will just borrow money and subsidize people in need. That's not the kind of compassion I think we need. I think we need to be asking ourselves what is really happening that's hurting Americans, and why can't we create a government that's leaner, more productive, that allows growth and prosperity to occur and not tax, regulate, and borrow our country into debt. It's a fundamental choice the nation is going to have to be dealing with. Indeed, my colleagues fundamentally are saying this. Well, we've got a problem in Washington. We don't have enough money. We just don't have enough money. We acknowledge we're borrowing too much money. The debt's too high. We're on an unsustainable course. But see, the problem is not us. We haven't overspent. We don't have programs that are running out of control. We have no unmanaged agencies and departments. The problem is, American people, you haven't sent enough money. Why don't you send some more money? That's what we need to have in this country. The American people need to understand how smart we are, how good we've managed their money, and if they'll just send us more money, we can figure out all of this and the government will take care of it. It's your fault, America. You're hard-headed. You won't send us more money. Send more money, and we'll fix the problems in America. I reject that idea. We've got to get our house under control and make our government leaner, focused on productivity, and serving the interest of people that are hurting right now. They are not doing well, and its economy is not doing well. I see other senators are here, Madam President, and I thank the Chair for the opportunity to share these thoughts and would yield the floor.
Madam President, Senator from North Dakota.
Madam President, I was presiding during the last exchange between the great senators from Louisiana and Tennessee, and I just was struck because as a junior member of this body, I get an opportunity to sit in the chair quite a bit. And I would just suggest to anyone, if you want to see someone who came to the floor, who predicted this outcome, who said it very, very early on. Senator Corker gave what I call the Box Canyon speech. He did it repeatedly because he could see what this would do if we continued to take hardline positions that really would achieve absolutely no results. And I think he has been a champion in calling out all of us to behave responsibly, to behave in a fiscally appropriate way. And so he has been a great mentor to very many of us who are very new in this body. We don't always share the same philosophies, but I certainly appreciate his willingness to tell the truth and to talk common sense. And that's really why I came to the floor today, because I initially, when I came here, thought I would write a book. That makes no sense. Talking about all the things that we do and what we say, and how what we do doesn't really match up all that well with what we say. And I have to admit that in the last couple weeks, my father's voice has come over and over to me. My father never went to high school, had an 8th grade education, but he was part of the greatest generation, a World War II vet. And he had an expression for his 7 kids in 9 years, 7 of us in 9 years, when we would do things that he thought lacked common sense. He would say, "How darn dumb are you?" And I'm sure you know it wasn't darn, but I will use that in the interest of propriety here. And so I rise today to talk about those things that we are doing now that make no sense. You have heard in the last hour and a half a lot of discussion about fiscal accountability and fiscal responsibility. Senators coming with their perspective on how we need to live within our means. I totally agree. But think about this. Think about where we are right now today, adding to our debt and deficit by a dysfunction that is completely made right here in Washington, D.C. I'm going to mention 3 things. The first thing is the House of Representatives consistently not voting, not taking up the CR, which was negotiated, short-term, negotiated, agreed to, but not putting that CR on the floor for a vote, but then voting unanimously. The same people who voted to not let people work voted to pay people not to work. Think about what the American public sees when they see that we won't let people who want to work. They know their work's piling up. They're committed public servants. We have read, the Washington Post has been replete with stories about people who want to get back to their jobs. They want to be public servants. So we vote so they can't go to work, but we pay them not to go to work. We won't let them work, but we pay them not to go to work. And in the meantime, we don't have anyone to check out disaster counts in North Dakota. We don't have BLM permits that are being issued in Indian country to help the struggling Indian nations in my state achieve some economic parity. We don't have things getting done. And there's no bill over there in this headline CR. That's what I call it. It's the headline CR. Whatever in the headline, we'll pass a bill to fix that. That's no way to run a government. It makes no sense. And let's talk about the debt. Let's talk about the need to control our debt and have a deficit reduction and a long-term plan to paying down our debt. Why is it important? Because we pay interest on that. And every dollar of interest that we pay, that's another dollar that we don't have for Head Start. That's another dollar we don't have for education or research or for higher education. So this is a real problem. So what are we doing? We have people who have said, it doesn't matter. We don't need to pay our debt. We can just decide which bills we're going to pay. And I'm like, every person in America, they know that when they go to check their credit score, if you're going to get a car loan, right? Get a car loan, and you want to go to the bank to get a car loan, they say, well, you don't have a high enough credit score, so we're going to deny your car loan. And they go, but what's the problem? And they say, well, you missed credit card payments, and you missed your mortgage payment. And you say, but I always paid my car loan. That's not the way it works. That is not the way it works. What they know and what the American people know is that if you don't pay all your bills, your credit rating goes down. Your credit rating goes down. And the tragedy of this is that we are not only going to add to the debt and deficit of this country by playing this brinkmanship, we are going to hurt every American who relies on credit. Whether it's a mortgage, whether it's a car loan, whether it's a student loan. We've now linked student loans to this problem. Think about the dollars and think about what's happening to the American people when we don't do the things that we need to do. We shut down government, but won't let people go to work, won't let people serve the public, but then say, oh, don't worry, we're going to pay you. And then we cost, by shutting down this government, we have cost millions and millions and billions of dollars, adding to the debt and deficit, dollars that we didn't have to spend. And now we're going to play this brinkmanship in our debt limit. We're going to shake up not only the American markets, we're going to add to the interest costs not only of the American people and of this government. We already have in the markets discounting of our Treasury bills. We already have seen exactly what's going to happen. And the longer this impasse stays, the more dramatic this result's going to be. This vote that we took yesterday in the Senate sent a message, and the wrong message, I tell you, the wrong message to the markets. We need to send the right message. We need to come together. We need to lead from the Senate, because the House, which isn't even in session today, addressing this problem, seems to think that there's no problem with the debt limit, that there's no problem with not paying our bills. There's no problem with paying people and not letting them work. And you know what my dad would say? How darn dumb are you? And what I say is, that makes no sense, because as passionate as what I know they are about debt and deficit reduction, the reality is what we're doing is adding to the debt and deficit. What we are doing is justifying a 5% approval rating for the United States Congress. Every day we're here that we don't achieve a result. Every day we're here that we don't solve this problem. How can you argue the American public's judgment is wrong? Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from California.
Very much. Madam President, we're in the 13th day of a self-inflicted crisis brought to us by the Republicans. And why did this happen? Why are we in the 13th day of a shutdown? A 13th day of the American people not being able to count on their government, which is supposed to be of, by, and for the people. Why? Because Speaker Boehner, over in the House, said he doesn't believe the American people want the Affordable Care Act, and even though he believed they didn't want to shut down, unfortunately, that's what he brought to the nation. That is horrible news. Horrible news. People are suffering. People are struggling. Hundreds of thousands of people are not getting their paycheck. And Americans know a lot of us do count on that paycheck. It's not like we have massive amounts of savings behind it. You don't get that paycheck, you're in trouble. How do you pay the mortgage? How do you pay the rent? That's what's happening. We've got police officers talk to me yesterday, trying to use some gallows humor to explain away their fears. They're afraid. They can't pay the bills. They have families. This is a disgrace. A self-inflicted disgrace on our nation. And I haven't even gotten to the issue that's staring us in the face. Perhaps the first time in history that America would not pay its bills, a default, even though the Constitution is clear and it says essentially the bills, the debts of the United States shall not be questioned. That's in the Constitution. Well, they're being questioned. We have a situation where not only are these employees of the federal government being laid off and not getting paid, and the communities in which they live are going to suffer because they really can't go down to the corner store, but the contractors are not getting paid. The small businesses are not getting paid. Road projects that I know something about as chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, many new projects are stopped in their tracks, not because people aren't ready to go, but because all the various sign-offs that have to be made before you start a project cannot be made. Investigations into chemical explosions that kill people every single year in America stopped in their tracks. So we don't know why. Investigations into airplane crashes stopped in their tracks. Little kids kept out of Head Start. Why? Because the Republicans don't like the Affordable Care Act. What is it that they don't like about the Affordable Care Act? I ask rhetorically. Do they not like the fact that 3 million adults in America are now insured through their parents' plan? I'm sure many in your state, Madam President, I know in my state over 1 million. Are they that upset that they want to shut down the government because people are getting insurance? 8 million? No, let me revise this. 71 million people across the country, 8 million in my state, getting free preventive services, including immunization. Are they that upset that they would shut down the government and make our people suffer and shut the doors? 17 million kids with pre-existing conditions like asthma and diabetes can no longer be denied health insurance coverage. Madam President, you are a champion for children. I can imagine how you feel about this. They want to repeal a law that finally has protected 17 million kids with pre-existing conditions like asthma and diabetes. There are no more lifetime limits on policies. There was a magnificent piece written in the Washington Post by one of my constituents, a mom, a freelance writer, who talks about a son who was born with a brain tumor, and over the years they've had to have operation after operation after operation, and they came an inch away from reaching the lifetime limit on the policy, $500,000, and they learned that the Affordable Care Act passed and this child got his health care. And now, as she says, he's talking and he's walking and he's shooting baskets. I saw that mom and the son on the Lawrence O'Donnell show the other night, and if you haven't seen it on MSNBC, I think you ought to take a look at it. So you have to wonder, what is it that they're trying to do? Now, what's interesting, if you listen to my colleagues now, they're off the Affordable Care Act. They kind of gave up on it. Because we said to them, this law passed 4 years ago. It has a steady stream of funding. It's got its kinks and its problems. We're going to work with you on that. But you can't stop it. It was upheld in the Supreme Court. You lost an election about it. Get a life. Figure it out. It's happening, okay? It's happening. So now they've got a new thing, deficits. Madam President, you're considered a fiscal conservative. And I just want you to, I want to remind you and everyone listening to the sound of my voice that not only did the Democrats lead the way on a balanced budget, we actually got surpluses at the time that Bill Clinton was president. How did we do it? We worked together with our Republican friends, but we passed a budget without one Republican vote. And we set the stage. And you know what happened? Not only did we have a surplus, in other words, we had extra money beyond a balanced budget, we had created, at that time, 23 million new jobs. What a glorious time. And we didn't do it by threatening to shut down the government. We didn't do it by threatening to default on the full faith and credit of the United States of America. We did it by sitting down, looking at each other, smiling, shaking hands, and working together. Let's open up the government, let's pay our bills, and then let us sit down and really debate how we're going to get to a balanced budget. We have a lot of history to draw from. We do know when you put 2 wars on a credit card and the biggest tax break to millionaires in history on a credit card and a prescription drug benefit on a credit card, it's a problem. That's why we saw under George W. Bush surpluses turn immediately into deficits. Now our colleagues suddenly are deficit hawks. Where were they when George W. was putting all this on the credit card? And now they don't want to pay the bills. It's unbelievable. This is not complicated. This is a self-inflicted crisis. You keep the government open, you pay the bills, and through regular order with my friend, the good senator from Alabama, and my friend, the great senator also from Washington State, sitting down, hammering it out. We bring in Paul Ryan, we bring in the House Democrats, and we sit down, and through them, we get a path forward. Everything that is happening now is unnecessary. I want to repeat that. Everything that is happening now is unnecessary. 13th day of a shutdown, pain and suffering throughout the country. I've got a little community in Los Angeles. Little kids have, their noses are bleeding, they're sick. They live near some industrial site. EPA said they were getting on it. EPA got the message, you're out. We can't help you. We're closed down. 92% furloughed. And you'll notice in all those little mini bills, Madam President, you didn't see anything about that. No watchdogs anymore. You know, their watchdogs are gone. We can't have government by press release. We can't have government by mini bills. We are the greatest nation in God's earth, and we need to open the doors and let the people in. We have elections. Elections have consequences. Republicans control the House, it is true. But Democrats control the Senate and the White House. Therefore, we need to work together. We don't threaten to shut down. I'd ask for 60 seconds.
Without objection.
So here's the good news. The good news is we have a bill over in the House. It's a clean, continuing resolution. Would open up the doors to government immediately. And it's a very short-term CR, continuing resolution, and would still preserve everyone's right to sit down and negotiate through regular order. We have a strong budget chairman. We have a strong budget ranking member. America has gotten to know them well. And the same in the House. Therefore, I put my faith in those folks under regular order. So we could open up this government in 5 minutes. We could pass a clean debt in 7 minutes. And then we sit down and negotiate. I did speak with Leader Reid this morning, and I feel he is optimistic that we're going to get there. I really do. And it lifts my spirits. Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid have been around here a long time. They've had their ups and downs and sideways and everything else, like everybody in the relationships here. But I think they know the moment of history is calling them, and I put my faith in that. And I hope I'm right, and I thank you, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Madam President. Yesterday, Senate Republicans rejected a cloture motion on a strictly party-line basis for a simple measure to prevent default for the United States of America. This bears repeating. Yesterday, we voted on whether or not to proceed to a bill to prevent default, and not one Senate Republican voted for it. I think it's fair to say that many of the Senate Republicans are operating in good faith and have a strong desire to get out of this mess, but they're concerned about embarrassing and undermining the Speaker of the House by moving too quickly on this measure. Well, Madam President, too quickly came and went a couple of months ago, and worrying about undermining the Speaker of the House should not be our primary concern. Given the crisis upon us, we should be singularly focused on protecting the dollar as the reserve currency, maintaining our ability to borrow at the lowest possible rate, and retaining our ability to solve problems as the greatest nation in the world. The time for worrying about the implications for one or the other political party or a faction within it is long since past. It's time to reopen the government, to pay our bills, to ensure the full faith and credit of the United States, and to return to the negotiating table on all of the challenges in front of us. In short, it's time to get back to governing in the way that we should. I'd like to emphasize a point that's not made often enough about the current crisis, and that is this. There is simply nothing conservative about the behavior of the House Republicans. Conservatives traditionally have been characterized by holding a respect for institutions, a focus on the needs of the private sector, and a desire to not waste money. Are these principles being upheld or subverted by the actions of House Republicans? First, with respect to our democratic institutions, the procedural violence being done to the United States Congress is hard to overstate in this case. The idea that a faction of a party is demanding concessions in exchange for ceasing their infliction of pain on America is unbelievable. Why? Because we are all Americans here, and we all want to do right by our country. So the idea that one party is willing to inflict terrible pain on our country or else was so beyond the pale that there's no rule against it, because no one ever contemplated that a major political party would ever behave in such a way. The assumption has always been that elected leaders would find a better way to stand up for strongly held beliefs than by threatening to bring the American economy to its knees. Up until now, that has been a safe assumption. This is the least conservative behavior imaginable because it throws us into permanent crisis, unable to solve major problems for the foreseeable future. Second, conservatives traditionally have wanted to protect the free marketplace. Some default deniers surmise that maybe the United States government can service its debt while delaying other payments, that we can simply prioritize. The United States of America cannot do that. Even if it were operationally possible, with which the Treasury Department assures us it is not, it would cause such severe harm to markets and undermine our credibility so terribly that even talking like that may be doing damage to our economy. In 2011, Congress's delay in raising the debt limit forced the Department of the Treasury to take extraordinary measures to ensure that our government could pay its bills. GAO estimates that this raised Treasury's borrowing costs by about $1.3 billion in fiscal 2011. That's $1.3 billion in added government costs just for coming close to defaulting. And this does not include the lingering added costs to borrowing that continue beyond fiscal 2011. It also does not include the wasted time and resources that these extraordinary actions meant. After all, this manufactured crisis took Treasury Department focus away from other important cash and debt management responsibilities. The Bipartisan Policy Center projects that the full cost of that crisis to the federal government alone, not to the economy, just to the federal government, will be around $19 billion over the maturity of the debt. There is nothing conservatively virtuous about defaulting on what we owe. It will cripple free markets. It is Russian roulette played with a bullet in every chamber. There's nothing conservative about that. Finally, there is the conservative principle about saving taxpayer dollars. 2 points on this. First, with the likely passage of the House bill to provide retroactive pay to federal employees, let me tell you what is happening. We are paying federal employees to stay home. We are paying our dedicated federal workers who want to do their jobs not to do their jobs. This is not conservative. This is not liberal, for that matter. It is upside down. We are preventing federal employees from doing their important work, like assisting small businesses and combating terrorism. Let me be clear. Federal workers did not cause this shutdown and should not lose pay because of it. That's why I co-sponsored Senator Cardin's bill to make sure they receive back pay when the government reopens. Our nation's furloughed public servants want to work, and many federal civilian employees are being required to work during the shutdown without pay. While it doesn't make sense to punish federal workers for Congress's dysfunction, it makes way more sense to simply reopen the federal government. Still, the House refuses to vote on a clean continuing resolution. that could reopen the government tomorrow, but instead voted to give back pay after the shutdown ends. What is conservative about paying people to stay home? Second, this shutdown is costing us money, not saving us money. In just the first week, it cost the economy $1.6 billion in lost economic output and is estimated to cost an average of $160 million each additional day. This is hurting small businesses and working families across the country, and it is completely avoidable. Madam President, as you know, people are in real pain, and this needs to stop. There is nothing good in this shutdown or in the threat of default. As a progressive, I talked on this floor about how it hurts our economy, the American people, and the priorities that I'm fighting for. But you don't have to share my priorities to think this is an awful mess. You can be a rock-ribbed conservative, too. This is bad for all of us. There is a simple way to move forward, Madam President. Open our government, pay our bills, and start negotiating on the issues that matter. I yield the floor.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm pleased to join my colleague from Hawaii, Senator Schatz, and share his point, and I think most of the American people share his perspective that this is an awful mess and it's way past time that we fix it. I'm hearing from people in New Hampshire every day who are affected by the negative consequences of this shutdown. I heard from some employees at the Berlin prison. This is a medium security facility in the northern part of New Hampshire. It hasn't even been fully staffed up, doesn't have all of the inmates there, and several of the employees have emailed me talking about what their situation is. And one woman says, we're expected to work and not get paid for the time being, but it's going to be tough when both working members of the household are government employees who aren't getting paid. I'm expected to make my federal student loan payments on time, as well as my private student loans. How is one supposed to do that when the government isn't paying them? They expect payments, well, so don't we. I also heard from a gentleman whose family is back in New York because he's still getting settled in Berlin. He's got a child who's ill, and he says that he was told last week that any sick or annual leave could be used, but it would be considered as a non-paid day during this shutdown. He says, I've been dealing for the past 3 months with my youngest child who's been having kidney problems and had surgery recently. My wife also has been having kidney difficulty and had surgery. So now he says, I can't respond to my family's aid because I would be concerned about whether or not I'm going to be able to get paid for these sick days. So we're hearing from people across New Hampshire. Furloughed, hundreds of federal workers have been furloughed in the state. New Small Business Administration loans have been stopped. Federal Housing Administration and VA loans have been slowed. Facilities in the White Mountain National Forest have been closed. Now at a time this is the peak weekend for foliage in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and yet because of the shutdown, facilities, bathrooms in the White Mountain National Forest are closed, campgrounds are closed, the small businesses that depend on those for the rest of their season are taking a huge hit. So many of the manufacturing businesses in New Hampshire are being affected. I heard from a company called Nanocomp, which is a real innovative small New Hampshire company. It's produced the next generation carbon nanotube technology. They have a number of federal contracts. They've already been hit by sequestration. So this is a double whammy. And their CEO said to me, we would burn through our very thin cash reserves as the result of this shutdown, and when that money is burned, it's not able to be replaced, so our basic financial viability can be irrevocably damaged even after the crisis passes. For this company, the consequences of this shutdown could be irreversible. I heard from another small business owner with a company called Globophone. He called because he's so frustrated because, again, his government contracts aren't being paid. He doesn't know what that's going to mean. Their cash flow is uncertain. He's not sure if his line of credit with the bank is going to continue. Very real consequences from this government shutdown. And then, of course, on SBA loans. According to the Granite State Development Corporation, which is one of the largest SBA lenders in New Hampshire, about 20 loans have been put on hold with the Granite State Development Corporation because of that shutdown, this shutdown. And then we've heard from some of our community banks who provide for SBA loans that those loans are being held up. There is no doubt that this is having a huge impact in New Hampshire, on families, on small businesses, that it's having an impact across this country. And that's affecting economic activity. As the presiding officer said so well in his comments, this is having a huge impact on how the economy of this country is doing. And as we think about the concerns that we've heard expressed about the debt and the deficit, you know, one of the real improvements to reducing the deficit and the debt as this economy recovers is the recovery itself. It's improved economic activity. It's making sure that businesses can do better, they can hire more workers, people get back to work, they can pay their taxes. And yet, that very economic recovery is what's being threatened right now by this shutdown. We know that as bad as this shutdown is, and we're in the 13th day, that 4 days from now we have an even more disastrous potential impact to this country and to our economy looming. Economists across the ideological spectrum have warned that if the federal government defaults on paying our bills, if we reach that debt ceiling and so we don't continue to pay our bills, we could see businesses stop hiring, retirement accounts and families' nest eggs could lose much of their value overnight, interest rates would rise, which means higher costs for consumers, small businesses, and the federal government. And consumer confidence, which is so important for small businesses, would drop sharply. We're seeing that already. In the last few weeks, we've seen the sharpest drop in consumer confidence since the fall of Lehman Brothers back in 2008. Now, we've heard from some people who are debt deniers, debt ceiling deniers, that these are just scare tactics, that these horrible consequences wouldn't happen. But in fact, we saw that in 2011, when we were having this debate again about whether we should raise the debt ceiling or not, that there were dire consequences to that debate. In late July and early August, leading up to the debt deal of 2011, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 2,000 points. As the result of that drop, average Americans with retirement accounts and other investments saw their household wealth plummet by $2.4 trillion. Our credit rating was downgraded for the first time in America's history, and the crisis resulted in an additional $1.3 billion in borrowing costs for the federal government. As the presiding officer said so well, if you care about the debt and the deficits facing this country, why would we inflict that kind of a burden again on the economy by saying we're not going to raise the debt ceiling? The potential consequences if we refuse to raise the debt ceiling: on November the 1st, we've already heard from Treasury Secretary Lew that Social Security and Medicare, which have been not been affected by the shutdown, would clearly be affected by a default, that it could delay or disrupt Social Security checks, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, military salaries. And according to the Treasury, delayed or disrupted payments would prevent 57.5 million Americans from receiving Social Security benefits in a timely manner. This could put the most vulnerable people in America in jeopardy. It could prevent them from receiving the benefits that they've earned, the benefits they need to live on. My former colleague and fellow Senator, Judd Gregg, a Republican, and I don't always agree on everything, but we certainly agree on the negative consequences of our failure to act to increase the ability of this country to pay its bills. In an op-ed that was published by the Hill newspaper, Senator Gregg said that the brinkmanship on default is, and I quote, the political equivalent of playing Russian roulette with all the chambers of the gun loaded. It is the ultimate no-win strategy. A default would lead to some level of chaos in the debt markets, which would lead to a significant contraction in economic activity, which would lead to job losses, which would lead to higher spending by the federal government and lower tax revenues, which would lead to more debt. That sums it up pretty well. Senator Gregg, I think, understands, as I think most of us do in the House and Senate, that for us to refuse to raise this debt ceiling, to allow the country to pay its bills, to allow the country to default, would be short-sighted, it would be irresponsible and reckless, and I hope that we are all going to come together to get this done in the next couple of days and save this country from even more disastrous consequences. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, the vote yesterday was to raise the debt ceiling without altering by 1 penny the spending and debt path we're on. It was demand by Senator Reid and the majority that we raise the debt ceiling, just give the President another trillion or however many billion dollars it was, and we're not going to, no commitment to make any changes in how we got here. That was not what we did in August of 2011. We agreed to reduce the growth of spending over 10 years by $2.1 trillion in exchange for raising the debt ceiling $2.1 trillion. Of course, we've already spent all that. We've already borrowed now almost $2.1 trillion more, and they're demanding a clean debt ceiling where we raise the debt ceiling but don't bother to ask us to change our spending habits, not 1 penny. That's wrong. You can't negotiate on the debt ceiling. So I just think it's perfectly appropriate. The House is prepared to do this, but they want some changes in how we're spending the taxpayers' money. The American people are tired of it. By a huge majority, they say we should not raise the debt ceiling unless we change our spending habits. Actually, almost a quarter of the American people say we should live within our income, we shouldn't raise the debt ceiling at all. And the idea that the President of the United States would not pay the bondholders of the United States, the debt holders of our country, if the debt ceiling were not raised is just unthinkable. Of course he will. He has to, really, under the Constitution. If we did not raise the debt ceiling, we would be bringing in $240 billion a month. And the interest on our debt is $20 billion a month. And that should be the first thing that's paid, and I'm sure would be if that were to happen. But I agree, the shutdown needs to end, and the debt ceiling impasse needs to be dealt with and get past it. We really do. It's not good for America, but we cannot just say we're not going to do anything. We're just not going to make any changes in our habits around here. And that's what's at stake. So let me take a few minutes to walk through our situation, how we got here, especially with discretionary spending, and I hope this will be helpful to my colleagues. It's a product of our work on the Budget Committee, where I'm ranking member. Many will remember in the summer of 2011 that Congress and the President engaged in a vigorous debate, tough negotiations about how to best address runaway annual deficits of $1 trillion a year. Matter of fact, over 5 years, we've added $6 trillion to the debt of the United States of America. And it was ultimately resolved, our discussions were, with the passage of the Budget Control Act. The BCA, as it is called, had at its heart 3 agreements. First, it required a vote in each House of Congress on a balanced budget. And, of course, the Senate voted that down, but a majority, I believe, voted for it, but it didn't get the supermajority for a constitutional amendment. Second, it allowed the President to increase the debt limit by $2.1 trillion, subject to a congressional vote, and that occurred. And third, it provided spending controls of at least $2.1 trillion, equal to the debt limit increase over 10 years. So the debt ceiling has already been reached in 2 years, a little over, and we are still not honored the commitment to reduce the growth of spending by $2.1 trillion over 10 years. It was to rein in government spending, and the BCA did 2 things. It placed statutory caps or limits on discretionary spending, that's the general programs of our government, which totaled $915 billion over 10 years, $915 billion. And it was enforced by sequestration, and it called for an additional $1.2 trillion of future savings from any combination of entitlements and revenues agreed to by the so-called super committee that the legislation formed to try to reach some agreement, overall long-term improvement in our financial condition, and this committee was given a challenge to do that. And if they failed, then additional reductions, the $1.2 trillion in discretionary spending limits would be enforced, or the cuts would occur through a sequester mechanism. So the sequester was very clear, very real. It mandated in the entire legislation $2.1 trillion in reduced spending, but it allowed the committee to look for ways to do it. If the committee didn't form, there would be some automatic cuts. So with nearly $1 trillion of savings were booked initially, the super committee went to work, but unfortunately they failed to make recommendations to Congress to deal with the other savings required under the Act. And so I commend the members of the committee. They tried their best, I do believe, but they didn't reach an agreement. With that failure, the BCA outlined the path forward. $1.2 trillion in spending reductions, including counting interest savings in both defense and non-defense operations, spread out evenly over the 9 years left between the fiscal years 2013 and 2021. Due to a variety of other laws passed over the years, primarily the 1990 deficit deal and the 2010 so-called Pay-As-You-Go Act, which was passed on a deficit debt limit increase also. That change was passed. That legislation went through in 2010 on a debt limit increase. The reductions do not apply to all federal spending programs, but only to those that are not exempt from enforcement. Many social programs are totally exempt. The food stamp program does not get a dime in reductions. Medicaid gets not a dime in reductions, for example. These cuts were to begin in January of 2013, but were delayed until March of this year, 2013, inside that fiscal cliff agreement bill we reached, the American Taxpayer Relief Act, in January. So when the sequester took effect on March 1st, it covered both discretionary and some mandatory spending, but less on mandatory. Discretionary spending was reduced a total of $68 billion for this fiscal year, $43 billion of that will fall on defense, and $26 billion on non-defense spending. Additionally, they each represent about half of the federal government expenditures in the discretionary accounts. Additionally, $17 billion in identified mandatory spending was sequestered, of which 11 came from Medicare. So total reductions were $85 billion. Not a whole lot when you're spending $3,500 billion, but 85 was at least progress downward in spending a little bit, at least from the growth of spending. Looking ahead, colleagues have asked me what happens under the Budget Control Act next. In 2014, spending will be restrained on both the mandatory and discretionary side of the ledger at the rates, approximate rates I just mentioned. For mandatory spending, this is mainly Medicare, a sequester began on October 1st, totaling $18.8 billion. Medicare spending will be reduced by a little over $11 billion. And the rest of the mandatory savings will come from reductions in defense mandatory. There are some programs in the Defense Department that are mandatory also. Most of the Defense Department is discretionary. So even the mandatory spending hit defense. And certain administrative expenses for federal benefit programs and so forth. For discretionary spending, the direction is down. Under the BCA, total regular discretionary spending is planned to be at $967 billion this upcoming year, split between $498 billion for defense, $469 billion for non-defense, although non-defense got less of a cut than defense. This year's non-defense number is just the same as last year. It's frozen. So the non-defense discretionary spending does not take another cut this year. It's flat. Defense will be taking an additional $18 or $20 billion reduction this year under the BCA. A so-called clean continuing resolution would come in at an annual rate of at $986 billion due to the fact that it keeps non-defense spending below the BCA caps while